In the annals of American true crime, few names evoke the same level of horror and revulsion as Albert Fish, a man whose crimes were so depraved that they shook the country to its core in the early 20th century. Fish was a predator, a sadist, and a cannibal. But perhaps the most horrifying part of his story was not just what he did, but what he chose to share afterward. In 1934, years after the disappearance of Grace Budd, a 10-year-old girl he had lured away under the false promise of a party. Fish did something that still chills investigators and historians alike. He sat down and wrote a letter, not to the police, not to a confessor, but to Grace's mother. The contents of that letter were beyond disturbing. In gruesome detail, he described how he had taken her daughter, what he had done to her, and how he had cooked and consumed her body. He described the methods of preparation, the cuts he made, and the pleasure he claimed to have taken in the act. The letter was not a confession for redemption. It was an extension of the torment, a final act of cruelty toward a grieving mother, a reminder that he not only took Grace's life, but reveled in the suffering he caused. In the late 1980s, Charles Cullen was working at a hospital in New Jersey, and he started killing patients. Sometimes he would go and inject them with overdoses of drugs. Other times, he would add the drugs to IV bags in the supply room, so a random patient would get the overdose at some later time. He was suspected many times at different hospitals. Some of his co-workers thought he was unsafe and refused to work with him. At least one patient, before her death, identified him as the creepy male nurse who snuck into the room and injected me with something. Each time hospital managers started to suspect him, they realized that if they called the police, they would immediately be sued by the families of everyone who died. So they didn't call the police. Each time they just fired him and reported nothing. He would just move on and get a job at a different hospital. He kept working as a nurse at various hospitals and kept killing people until 2003. After he was eventually caught, investigators found hard evidence of 29 murders, and he gave detailed confessions to a total of 40. But he is thought to have committed up to 400. The true number will never be known, because so much evidence was destroyed or covered up by the hospitals. David Parker Ray is known as the Toy Box Killer. He built a soundproof trailer in New Mexico, which he called his Toy Box. This was not a toy box at all. It was a torture chamber. Inside, he brought his victims, mostly women, and tortured them for hours or even days. He used whips, chains, medical tools, and other devices. What made his crimes even more disturbing is what he did before the torture began. David Parker Ray recorded detailed audio tapes. In them, he calmly explained what he was about to do to his victims. These recordings were long and graphic. He would play the tape for each new victim before the abuse started, forcing them to listen to the horror that was coming. He treated these acts like a twisted routine, carefully planned and coldly carried out. Although he is suspected of killing many women, most of their bodies were never found. He once claimed there were as many as 60 victims. David Parker Ray died in 2002, before he could be fully brought to justice. Some stories are so profoundly disturbing that they stay buried in the corners of our collective memory, not out of forgetfulness, but out of a need for emotional survival. One such story involves a man whose name doesn't deserve to be remembered, but whose actions shook those who heard them to the core. He made the unthinkable decision to murder his own daughters. It happened at a lumber mill, secluded, isolated, a place where no one could hear their voices. While one daughter waited patiently in the car, he led the other to her death. He strangled her, a brutal act made more haunting by the innocence of the life he chose to take, and then he returned for the second child. She looked up at her father, and, with unimaginable clarity, asked, "Are you going to do the same to me, Daddy?" She was only around 4 years old. She didn't run, she didn't fight. She simply accepted her fate in a moment that should never exist for any child. When the details of this crime came to light, they devastated not just the public, but especially those who had children of their own, particularly daughters. For many, the story became a source of unbearable sorrow, a constant reminder of the fragility of innocence and the unimaginable horror of betrayal from the one person meant to protect above all. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka became known as the Ken and Barbie Killers, a nickname that hid the horror of what they had done. After her release from prison, Karla married a relative of her lawyer. She later caused public outrage when she was seen volunteering at a school where her children were enrolled. But the story begins years earlier. During one holiday season, Karla gave her younger sister as a gift to her boyfriend Paul. Paul was a known rapist, and Karla used drugs from her job at a vet clinic to keep her sister unconscious. They drugged her heavily and assaulted her in the basement of Karla's parents' house. Her sister never woke up. The combination of drugs and alcohol was too much. Karla claimed it was an accident. Even more disturbing, they placed a photo of themselves in the sister's casket. She was buried alongside an image of her abusers. It was cruel, twisted, and deeply unsettling. During the trial, an old TV episode showed Karla giving a tour of her home. She wore a schoolgirl uniform, similar to the ones Paul's victims wore. This happened before police found the videotapes showing that Karla was just as involved as Paul. But by then, it was too late. Karla had already made a deal with prosecutors. She claimed she was forced to help Paul and agreed to testify against him. This deal gave her a much lighter sentence. When the tapes were discovered later, they showed Karla taking part willingly in the crimes. But the deal couldn't be undone. Many people believe this was one of the biggest mistakes in Canadian criminal history. For many years, California was living in fear. A mysterious man broke into homes, attacked couples, and vanished without a trace. It wasn't until recently that people realized this same man was behind 3 terrifying identities: the Visalia Ransacker, the original Night Stalker, and the Golden State Killer. His real name was Joseph James DeAngelo. DeAngelo had a terrifying pattern. He would break into a couple's home at night. He tied up the man and placed dishes or plates on his back. Then he would rape the woman in another room. The sound of plates falling would warn him if the man tried to move. That way, DeAngelo would know if there was a threat. These attacks lasted for hours. He would stop what he was doing to look through the kitchen and even eat snacks. He was calm, cruel, and in complete control. DeAngelo was also extremely patient. He would watch homes for days or even weeks before an attack. He looked for patterns: when people left the house, when they were alone, where the lights were. He often found ways to sneak in early and hide ropes or tools inside the house, getting ready for a later break-in. He would return to attack when he knew no one would see him. He was careful, quiet, and planned everything. The people living there had no idea that he had been inside their home already. Joseph DeAngelo terrorized families for years. He wasn't caught until decades later, when DNA evidence finally revealed who he really was: a former police officer who had lived among the very people he hunted. For 20 years, Fred and Rosemary West killed people. They buried many of their victims in and around their home. Some were hidden under floors or in the backyard. Their own children lived in the house, not knowing the truth. One of the saddest parts of this story is that they buried their first daughter under the back porch. Her grave was just outside, while life went on inside the house. When police finally arrested them, Fred said he would take full blame. He wanted to protect Rosemary, but he gave too many details to the police, and in doing so, he accidentally got Rose involved. After that, Rose turned her back on Fred. She said she had nothing to do with the crimes. She tried to look like a victim. But it didn't work. Rosemary West was found guilty and sent to prison, where she still is today. This case reminds many people of Karla Homolka in Canada. Karla and her husband, Paul Bernardo, also hurt and killed young girls. Karla told the police that she was forced to help Paul. She made a deal with them before they found out how involved she really was. Unlike Rose, Karla was not given a long sentence. She is now free and living a new life. The crimes of Dean Corll, also known as the Candyman, are among the most horrifying in US history. But beyond the murders themselves, there is another deeply disturbing part of the story. When authorities began to excavate the boat shed where many of the victims were buried, they used only shovels. Even worse, they brought in labor from the local drunk tank, people who were not trained for this kind of work. The shed was made of aluminum, and this was happening during the intense Texas heat. The conditions were brutal and inhumane. These workers had no protective gear. They were given no proper tools. They were digging up decomposing human remains with their bare hands and simple shovels. Then, after body number 28 was found, between the shed and another known burial site at High Island Beach, the police suddenly stopped the search. This was despite the fact that Corll's accomplices had clearly stated there were at least 4 more bodies buried between those 2 locations. Many believe this decision was a shocking failure by the police department. To make matters worse, families who had tried to report their sons missing were often ignored or dismissed. In this case, the lack of care shown during and after the investigation was almost as haunting as the crimes themselves. Richard Ramirez, infamously known as the Night Stalker, left a chilling trail of terror across Southern California in the mid-1980s. Beyond the horrifying violence he inflicted, some disturbing patterns emerged in his behavior at crime scenes. Ramirez was known to vomit at the locations of his murders, an act believed to stem from a combination of adrenaline, psychological disturbance, and possibly even remorse or fear. But his revulsion didn't end there. In several cases, he mutilated his victims and removed their eyes, keeping them as macabre trophies. Yet for all his posturing as a servant of evil, Ramirez revealed a deep cowardice in the selection of his victims. Though he lived in downtown Los Angeles, his killing spree largely bypassed the city's most hardened neighborhoods, such as East Los Angeles and Boyle Heights, areas known for their strong communities and where people were less likely to remain passive. Instead, he deliberately targeted the more suburban and isolated homes of the San Gabriel Valley. To reach these locations, Ramirez would drive through the very communities he feared, passing them by in search of victims he deemed more vulnerable and less likely to resist. This calculated route paints a telling picture. Richard Ramirez wasn't just a killer. He was a predator who preyed on the defenseless while avoiding any situation where he might encounter real resistance. One of the most heartbreaking stories from the Yorkshire Ripper case involves the father of Jane MacDonald, one of the young victims. Jane's father, Mr. MacDonald, had fallen asleep on the couch one night. He was waiting for his daughter to come home from university. Later, he said he felt something unusual while he slept. He believed Jane had come into the room quietly, kissed him gently on the head, and then gone upstairs to her room. But that moment never really happened. He was suddenly woken by a knock at the door. It was the police. They told him that Jane's body had been found near her university. She had been murdered. In shock, Mr. MacDonald checked her room and the rest of the house. That's when he realized something truly painful. Jane had never made it home at all. He was confused and heartbroken. At first, he refused to believe it was true. He thought the police must have made a mistake. But there was no mistake. Jane was gone, and the memory of that imagined kiss would haunt him forever. Luis Garavito, known to the world as La Bestia, the Beast, holds the harrowing distinction of being the most prolific serial killer in recorded history. Official records confirm at least 193 victims, though the true number is suspected to be even higher. Garavito's victims were primarily young boys, many of them homeless children living on the streets, some of the most vulnerable members of society. He lured them with promises of food, money, or small gifts, only to subject them to extreme and prolonged abuse before ending their lives. His crimes spanned across Colombia, with a smaller number committed in Venezuela and Ecuador. But it was Colombia that bore the brunt of his reign of terror, a country already struggling under the weight of violence and unrest. In a move that shocked much of the world, Garavito was eligible for parole in 2023 due to legal constraints in the Colombian justice system. However, before that could become a reality, he died in prison in 2023, sparking both relief and renewed debate about justice for his countless victims. Luis Garavito wasn't just a serial killer. He was a predator who exploited the forgotten, a man whose crimes serve as a grim reminder of the consequences of systemic neglect and unchecked evil.